Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. A couple weeks back, I chatted with Tobi Olowe, Impressions of America co-host. This is the third episode in our Impressions of America podcast series. If you haven't done so already, I recommend you listen to my interviews with Tobi's fellow co-hosts, Vaughn Joy and Simon Heppenstall. Fascinating stuff. Today, Tobi tells us about the human potential movement of the 1960s. Can I tell you a little secret? When Tobi pitched the topic, I knew nothing about it, or so I thought. Turns out, I actually lived it and/or studied the works of many of the movement's identified proponents. Think Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and Charlotte Bueller. According to Tobi, the human potential movement is an all-encompassing one, driving and/or driven by art, psychology, and social justice movements like civil rights. I'll tell you up front, this is an intellectual, philosophical journey with pit stops at some of the familiar historical figures and pop culture references of the period. So buckle up, crank on your lava lamp, and enjoy the ride. Tobi Olowe, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So we just get right off into the races, and I ask you the question, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
My favorite history that we're going to be talking about is the human potential movement that really took root in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a product of the emerging counterculture in America. Many of the leading lights of the human potential movement, like Abraham Maslow, sort of threw out the conformity of the 1950s and tried to create a kind of a way of living, a way of being that was really in line with the counterculture. So that's my favorite history that I'm coming here to talk about. I think it's super interesting because this really didn't used to be my favorite history. I'm someone who loves the French Revolution and the incidents and the events of the French Revolution, these big events, the Robespierre taking over, the fall of Danton, or big events in America like the presidency of FDR, the attack on Pearl Harbor, things like that. But I think as I've grown older, I've developed an interest in history that is usable, history that is actionable, because in my work as a lobbyist and formerly working on some political campaigns, I find that understanding the past is really, really valuable for understanding where we're going, what people want now, what people wanted before, and why governments and people have made the decisions that they've made. And I really think that the human potential movement is so central to the story of now and the problems and the issues that we're having right now in the culture. And I don't think many people understand the real change that happened in the culture in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think it's central, it's really important, and it's really actionable information as well. So yeah, that's why it's my favorite history.
Well, it's interesting because when I was born in 1963, so when you suggested this topic, I wasn't really sure what it was. I just didn't know that was the name of it. So when I was going to college for social work, we studied a lot of the stuff you're talking about, self-actualization, but that was not too far in the past. So about 30, 40 years. Oh my God. So 40 years in the past. And then whatever. So I'm really interested. And I just have to say, like, I love that you guys, all three of you on Impressions of America, that you're so well versed in what you talk about and your understanding of, U.S. political history and whatever it is that you choose to talk about. But you guys are younger, and it makes me so hopeful that you're taking your great wisdom and your great ability to think, and you guys are all great thinkers, and that you're filtering and you're looking at and you're, reestablishing from the perspective that you're at.
Yeah, and it certainly isn't stuff that I learned at university when I was there. I mean, I did a bachelor's degree in history, which was just a bunch of different things, contemporary, medieval, different things. And then I specialized in MA in sort of the progressive era and some work on Theodore Roosevelt and antitrust, because I thought that was really important for some of the stuff that happened with Brexit, some of the antitrust stuff in America, and really the Trump phenomenon as well, with populism. I thought that was really, really important. But the human potential movement is something that I've only come to understand the gravity of from really doing the podcast. And in my own attempts, not as a scholar or an academic, I only have an MA, but in my own attempts to understand the political winds and to understand why things are the way they are, I've had to go back from reading the podcast and then finding out why things are the way they are. And it's really important that every generation goes back in order to try to reinterpret things in the past, because I feel like the Gen Xers would have looked at the human potential movement in a very different way from millennials had. And boomers, certainly, they were in amongst it, so they had a perspective on it. And older generations would have looked at sort of older Freudian psychology in different ways. So we keep going back to reinterpret things and to get what we need from the past in order to create our own futures, I think.
So backing up, you said, and I'm not sure how you worded it, but the relevance to now, you were talking about the movement and the relevance to now. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why, what the relevance is?
I would say that the human potential movement for me is really the connection between the right and the left in the 1960s and 1970s. Like, obviously, on the face of it, the right of William F. Buckley and Goldwater, they were stumping for, like libertarian economics, try to lower the minimum wage, to try to attack the Soviet Union, to try to weaken labor unions and things like that. And that's very different from what the left was fighting for. The left was fighting for civil rights, anti-war, and for personal authenticity. And this personal authenticity was the right to be one's own true self, the right to find one's own true self, the right to be actualized, to love the person that you want to love, to be where you want to be, to not be constrained by social conventions. And that's really what sprang up in the hippie movement, which was not so political, but was tied to this sort of cult of youth and nature, associated with many people like Jack Kerouac and other individuals who believed in America, but wanted to be free in a culture that they found that was deeply conformist. And that's not really close to what the right wanted. And most people look at these two movements and they don't see any interconnection. But I think historians have gone back and they've really seen some connection between these two movements, because what the conservatives were saying is, like, the economy is constraining you. William F. Buckley was talking about the constraints of the economy. Goldwater was talking about, even with regards to civil rights, he was saying that if you go into a store why should the store owner have to serve anyone? Like, if a black person goes into the store, why should the store owner serve him if the store owner doesn't want to? On its face, this seems like a racial argument. But in the construction of the argument, what Goldwater was saying was that people should be free to do whatever they want, you know? And what William F. Buckley was saying in The Economy is people should be free to do whatever they want. And then the left was saying people should be free to do whatever they want. So what you had is this interconnection, which is a broad movement that I see in the 1950s and 1960s. And it's really a reaction to the war, you know, really a reaction to authoritarian regimes in Russia and Germany. And intellectuals, both on the right and the left, trying to see that freedom was really what they wanted, you know. And Ayn Rand used to say that because I can think, I should have the ability to, because I know myself, I can think, and because I can think, I can actually act in the world, and because I can act in the world, I can change things. And so the only crime is coercion. The only crime is the government putting a gun to your face and saying you have to do something, you have to give off your taxes, or you go to jail for doing this and that. And in Ayn Rand's system, she couldn't say that, you know, being gay was wrong. She might have thought it personally, but she always said that being gay was just what you wanted to do. And so you had people on the right and the left advocating for this freedom that was really a reaction to the war, and really a need broadly in the culture, from Ayn Rand to Goldwater to William F. Buckley, and then on the other side with Jean-Paul Sartre, with Abraham Maslow, with the hippies and the yippies. Everyone was saying this thing that actually we need to get away from the constraints of the period. And I think the human potential movement really puts this together in the distinction between Freudian psychology and Abraham Maslow's real construction, because Freudian psychology was used in the 1950s really to try to pathologize behavior. So people would go to therapists. They would sit in these rooms with these psychoanalysts, and the psychoanalysts would say that the kinds of behaviors that you were exhibiting that were against the norm were these kinds of pathologies, you know. And people who were against the norm should be given psychometric drugs, or they should be sent to sanatoriums to change. And it was really about changing. And it was really a metaphor, but also a realization of the constraints of 50s society. You know, women weren't allowed to go into work. They weren't allowed to live how they wanted to live, to love the people who they wanted to love. And they were really constrained. And they would go to the therapist, and the therapist would say that, well, the feelings that you have of whether it's neurosis or pain, that's you exhibiting something that you shouldn't be feeling, and that we're going to help you not to feel that, to be fine with the conformity that you live under. And so you had a culture broadly that was really conformist, but breaking out of this culture was these writers, people like Norman Mailer, Abraham Maslow himself, Jean-Paul Sartre in France, Camus, writers like that. They focused on this sense of conformity, and it was epitomized in this writer called Reisman. It was David Reisman. Reisman wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. And in The Lonely Crowd, Reisman, and this was about 50 society, he was saying that the Americans used to be inner-directed, and inner-directed people live by their own principles and chase the things that they want. And he had this metaphor about going out into the frontier and being inner-directed and finding the things you want and living how you wanted to live. But the other people were tradition-directed, so they lived how within the constraints of the tradition. But American society in the 1950s, he felt, was a consumerist, conformist society where people they didn't really live by their own inner direction. They lived to see what the man in the gray flannel suit next door is, sort of like a Flanders character that lived everywhere. And you looked to see what he was doing, and then you just copied him. But what this created was a sense that people really weren't doing what they wanted. And it created a generalized need for psychology, need for therapy, and the field of psychology burst out and became really, really popular. The people were getting degrees and they could get good jobs in psychology because there was this need for psychology, need for therapists. But these therapists weren't really curing the thing that ails the people. But once Abraham Maslow has developed his Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it was influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre. It was influenced by a lot of these sort of existentialist thinkers who focused on, the internal and what was the internal drive and what people actually wanted. He came up with this idea that there was this hierarchy of needs, and at the base you had your basic needs, your survival needs, and then you get further top to self-esteem, to love, and then you get to self-actualization. And it was these self-actualizing people that he saw on the campus that he was working on, these young people, young, smart people who seemed to live by their own principles. They weren't constrained by the old conformity. They were into civil rights or they were into sort of libertarian thoughts, and they made decisions based on their own internal compass, and he saw them as psychologically healthier than their parents or than people in the general society. And he really thought that these people were going to be the future of society, basically. But in these people, what you start to see a connection between what the right is saying and what the left is saying. The right was saying that, okay, we have, so there should be social conformity, but in the market, you have the right to do whatever you want. And the left is saying that you should have the right to do whatever you want. That's what Kerouac is saying on the Road. That's what Allen Ginsberg is saying, and how. It's what writers were saying. And so there's this connection point, and I think that I find in the human potential movement. This is why I think the human potential movement is my favorite history right now. And I will sort of talk later on about why I think it's important for today.
That was a lot of information to take in. It's an interesting concept, and I would have never thought of it that way, yet your argument is very logical, and I can see that the right and the left were saying the same thing, but in different ways about different things. It wasn't all encompassing either, because obviously if it was, then we would have social justice. Let me just put it out there as a big lump. So it's always metamorphosing this movement and the energy from it and what's happening from it. And you've taken it to the political realm, you've taken it to the personal realm. You talk about art, and it's almost like what you're saying is art started putting those ideas out, and then the movement came. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I think it's like I used to think of history as about great men. As I grew up, you get into Mao and Stalin and all these great men. And then I sort of started to think about history more sociologically. And I think I was trained within social and economic history to think about, big groups. But I think anytime I would do that, I would end up thinking about ideas and how ideas take root and how ideas germinate into the culture and bubble up and come from the top downwards or down up. I think that's what I'm thinking about with this human potential movement. I really think it's about ideas. It comes from art. The Whitechapel Gallery, there was recently a Jackson Pollock exhibition. And Jackson Pollock was doing all these action paintings, and he would, put all the paintings on the walls. And really, it was a crazy American invention, because the MoMA art gallery that was started by the Rockefellers, usually they would just put on art from Europe. Art was considered to be a European thing, But Jackson Pollock made this abstract expressionism an American phenomenon, and it was the first real, I think, American art form in that, in the palette art. But Jackson Pollock's work had been used by the CIA in Soviet countries to try to inspire a revolt against the conformity of Soviet countries. And I think that what you find in Jackson Pollock is a self-expression, a loud, bustling, riveting self-expression. It's so dense. It looks like almost like a psychological story it's circular. It's really hard to get, to interpret, really hard to understand. Pollock was being an individual. And I think you see that in the work of Jack Kerouac as well. Kerouac's on the road. He's going through San Francisco. He sees the jazz. He sees the black people. He sees the art. He sees the women. He meets one woman. He's not interested in her anymore. He goes to another woman. Are really putting together what this kind of new world is going to be. It's more partial. It's not. You're not rooted in your nuclear family as much. You get to go where you want to go and be who you want to be. And it's a loud and thunderous call that I think is happening. And you mentioned the social justice, and I think on the left they really did care about social justice. They really did. Like the Black Panthers, they would have community meetings where they would give people food. They were genuine socialists. They were inspired by the Battle of Algiers, and they were inspired by Marxist movements in the Viet Cong and Marxist movements all over the world. But I think what they were reacting to in the society wasn't necessarily capitalism in a way. I mean, it was capitalism, but it wasn't capitalism because a lot of people don't really think about it. But in the economy in the 1960s in America was great. It offered people a social compact between, especially people in the emerging middle class. And by middle class, I don't mean like people in the PMC. I just mean people who had good regular jobs. They had access to healthcare. The economy was booming at 6-7% every year. Although there's the Korean War, there's the Vietnam War. But the reason why you had this big baby boomer generation who were attracted to hippiedom and who attracted to rock music and had this free time to become hippies or anti-wars because the economy was so strong. Right. You had such a strong economy. Right. And so they turned away from economic issues to more existential issues, to more ideas about personal freedom. And I think that's really the context for the human potential movement, especially as it relates to normal people. But it did come from the art. It came from Pollock. It came from Camus. It came from Kerouac. And I think Norman Mailer is probably the person who best expresses it because Mailer in the 50s, he had written a novel about the war in the 40s, and it made him quite famous. But he was sad that America no longer produced, Pulitzer Prize winning novels. Steinbeck wasn't doing it anymore. Hemingway was old. And he saw this vacuum in the culture, and he wondered why it existed. And he felt that it was the conformity that was creating it. And obviously, he was also reacting to the authoritarianism of the Soviet and German countries. And I think many of them felt that kind of managed society, managed by people in the corporate sector, managed by Freudian psychologists, managed by even the architectural conformity of urban renewal was really caging people. It was caging people. The conformity around sexuality was caging people. And I think the artists were really reacting to this, and they were the first ones to express it. And they really sold young people on their ideas, and the boomer generation really took that on. And I think in sort of the large social terms, it's really the legacy of the boomer generation, but it came from artists from the greatest and silent generation. I think the music was definitely silent. People like Jimi Hendrix were silent generation. The early Beatles, members of the early Beatles were silent generation. There's so many silent generation artists, but it was really the boomers were the first giant sociological group to really take it on. and make it meaningful for themselves. And they did have like some fantastic successes, you know. I mean, with this, the civil rights really came a little bit earlier, 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. But in terms of women's rights, the feminist mystique was really based on Maslow's, you know. And the feminist mystique, she writes that women in the home who don't go to work, and many of these were upper middle class women, but they weren't actualizing themselves. You know, a lot of them had depression. They would go to therapists for depression. And she wrote that according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they had their basic needs. They did have some sense of belonging because they had, you know, sort of easy access to love, but they didn't have the responsibility. They, you know, they did too much emotional labor, didn't have to do labor for themselves. They didn't work for themselves. They weren't learning. They weren't actualizing themselves in the world, and they weren't becoming the people that they wanted to be. And they were having real psychological problems because of it. And I think that this movement really helped women. It helped, you know, germinate the gay rights movement. It helped with African American rights, certainly negative rights, not necessarily positive, you know, more social justice rights. But I think it really helped. And it's an.
Can I stop you there just for a minute? Because you guys talk a lot about the negative rights. I've heard that in your pod. Can you just kind of? I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean when you say negative rights.
I think it's a concept that I didn't really understand myself until I heard about this guy called Isaiah Berlin, who was I think he was a philosopher at Oxford. He tried to come up with the two kinds of rights. There were positive rights and negative rights. And negative rights were basically the right to be left alone and do what you want. And then positive rights were the rights that you ask for from other people in terms of security and food and shelter and taxes and roads and things like that. So yeah, there's negative rights and positive rights. And in terms of these rights to just be left alone and do what you want and be who you want to be, there was some tremendous success from the artists broadly in the culture, I think, from the human potential movement and from the 60s and 70s generation. That's what I think. And I think it's borne out by some of the legislative successes they had. Some took very long. I mean, you still had Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, and there was terrible discrimination of gay people and African Americans. But by the time you get people who are politicians who were born in the early 1960s, you start to get conservative politicians who pushed through gay rights laws. And you had it in England with David Cameron. He was the one who really pushed through the Marriage Equality Act. So I think that's in the long arc, that's the positive, I would say, impact of the human potential movement, which was a good thing. Individualism, I think, has broadly been a good thing for society, but it's also why we have some of the problems that we have today, I think.
You seem to really connect to this movement, like emotionally, maybe even spiritually. It seems to really speak to you, and you're really saying all the positive things about it. Nothing's always positive, though. So, it seems like you're naturally segueing into, maybe some of the backlash. I keep thinking about the baby boomers, which I fight with my boyfriend about this all the time because I'm right. I straddle the line, and he's younger than me, so he's like not that much younger either. So he's that next generation. Awesome. The baby boomers also, they were such a part of like seeing the art and expressing themselves and everything you said. But then, how do we get the artifice of the 80s from the same group of people? And then my boyfriend always says, and I said this on the podcast several times, that, and I don't consider myself one of these people, but that Trump was the baby boomers' last hurrah. It does seem when you look at the people who did support him, not being one of them, that there was a lot of white male and female baby boomers who supported him. So how did that happen? When they were at the forefront of this movement?
What I would say first to start with the 80s, I think on the podcast we did Reagan, and we had Peter Robinson, who was a speechwriter for Reagan. He wrote the "Tear Down This Wall" speech, and he's written. He's a boomer.
Mm-hmm.
He's very connected to the Reagan, the Saint Reagan, the Saint Reagan artifice, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think in 1984, we had an episode in 1984 on the election in 1984, instead of doing 1980. And I think what we came to in 1984 is that Reagan won this almighty landslide. He won almost every state. It was the biggest election landslide since FDR in 1936. It was huge. And it showed that there was basically a dominant voice in the culture from boomers, from the silent generation, that wanted this conservative politician. And I think how Reagan sort of saw himself and what he presented himself, he really presented himself. We talked about the moral majority, but I think he really presented himself as a, get government off my back politician. He was, this is why government is bad. In this present crisis, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. And I think that the thing was broadly a sociological shift towards the right that is really a product of the human potential. Because a product of individuals not wanting their taxes to go to poor people, wanting to be able to spend money on themselves. Some people wanted to go to college who were either lower middle class or working class. The parents had never gone to college, and we wanted to go to college. Some people who were from sort of middle class backgrounds wanted to be rich, wanted to be yuppies, wanted to go into finance, want to go to Wall Street. You see that in movies like Wall Street. And some other people wanted to not live in the cities anymore. They didn't want to have to pay Black people, their financing. They want to have to bus their children to schools. They want the government to force them to bus their children to schools. They wanted to live in the suburbs, out of the cities. They started to hate New York dropped dead, things like that. And on some level, this is right wing, like it's conservative, right? It's not, but it is individualism. It's people wanting to better themselves, wanting to live what they want, wanting to do whatever they want. The reason why Mondale lost so terribly in 1984 was that people felt positively like they wanted more things in their lives. Just wanted to feel more positively about the economy, wanted to make more money. Wanted to be richer. The middle class wanted to be upper middle class. The working class people wanted to be middle class. I think it reflected negatively on other communities. I mean, African American communities were ravaged at this point. Reagan had the welfare queen thing.
So what I don't understand is, how did these people who were really concerned about social justice and and whatnot in the 60s, how do they become so selfish?
I think it's really hard, I think, because of how stark the social justice thing was. Like the Black Panthers were a social justice group, the Weather Underground, the SDS, the anti-war movement, all of these movements that were really they were individualistic, but they were collective, and the thought process was always like speaking out against racism is authentic. You're speaking, or that this is wrong, and you want to authentically speak out against it. You want to join groups, you want to fight against it. But I would say that the strength of those movements was tied to the events themselves. I think the 64 and 65 Act took the air out of the anti-racism movement. The end of the Vietnam War took the air out of the anti-war movement. And I would say that people went from trying to change the world to be individuals to changing themselves. And I think it's because the civil rights movement really ended. Nixon first, and then some other politicians instituted some affirmative action movement. So people like Huey P. Newton, who had been part of the Black Panthers, a lot of their resentments and a lot of resentment of people like Malcolm X was that they were really smart, really inventive, young African Americans who wanted to live great lives, but the social system of the 50s and 60s meant that they couldn't go to university, they couldn't go to Harvard, even if they had the grades. They couldn't go to Yale, they couldn't go into law firms. Their parents were, even however smart they were dishwashers. The people who were upper class in the African American community were actually people who had, low status jobs. They were bank tellers. They weren't being actualized or living how they wanted. And then you had these massive social crises, like the civil rights movements in the South, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement. You had all these movements that helped these marginalized people try to actualize themselves and try to fight against the system. But I think that they were successful in some of that. In the civil rights movement, they were successful to some extent. The women's movement was successful to some extent. They got into the jobs. They became actualized. Some African Americans who were from sort of more educated backgrounds were able to do the things they want. They were able to work in the government. They were able to do some of the things that they wanted. And as the real social crises receded into the 80s, then you started to see people move away from trying to change the world by being authentic to themselves, to try to be authentic to themselves, and then to try to change themselves and feel like if I change myself, I'll change the world.
Wow, that was quite a roller coaster ride you just took me on. That was a really good, thoughtful answer. So where do we see this today? Is there still a thread of this? Has it turned into another movement? Is it latent? What do you think?
And I think we see it in the self-help culture a lot, and movements like EST, movements like Scientology, actually. There's these, the thing that Abraham Maslow's came in with and the Esalen Center came with, ended up with movements like EST, which were about, I think it went from, changing the world, changing yourself, changing the world through authenticity, to changing yourself. And in the changing yourself, people started to not only believe that they could change themselves, but that they could do anything. So EST was all about self-actualization, and it was against victimhood, which is something that Ayn Rand was supporting. So if you can think, if you can act, if you can feel yourself, then you should be able to do the things that you want and change the things in your life that you don't like.
Were they a big component of transcendental meditation?
I would say it was the New Age movement, and I think transcendental meditation is within the New Age movement. But there was some meditation. But in the EST movement, you would go to these seminars, and Werner Erhard would, tell you about EST and how to actualize yourself, and they would put you through a danger zone process where you would go up on a ladder, and then you would fall off the ladder and expect that someone would be there to catch you. It was all about feeling that you could do whatever you want, and so that even if you put yourself in danger, you'll be able to save yourself in a way. And then there was other things that people would go to these EST centers, and you could see that it went from the conformity of the 50s and Freudianism to people actually not only thinking that they could change the things in their lives, but that they could control everything. So so some people, distraught people, would go there. Some people who had experienced the Holocaust, because at this time Holocaust survivors were still alive in the 70s and 80s. Some people who experienced the Holocaust would go there, and the Est people would tell them that they were responsible for putting themselves in the situation where the Nazis would send them to the Holocaust, which is crazy. Like, how could you think that someone could do that? But what the Est people were really saying is that you had control over the world. You can control anything. If something happens to you, and you feel victimized by it, you're not a victim. You control that situation. So you're never a victim in any kind of situation. And you can see how this is part of untethering the social justice point, because what it was saying is that people who were in difficult situations, single mothers, or people who were in prison, or all these kinds of people, they had made the choice to be in those situations. They had made the choice to make these bad decisions. You have choices. And so with these choices, if you made the bad decision, you're putting yourself in a bad situation. And then they were taking that so far. And you could see this in Est, but you could see this reverberating into the self-help culture. So in popular psychology, that is in the bookstores everywhere, and everywhere in England, to be honest, you read the stuff and it tells you, and it's really a product of the human potential movement, but it tells you that you have control over everything in your life. You can't be nudged in a particular way.
So it basically blames the victim. It's basically blaming the victim.
It leads to victim blaming. You can see how part of it was empowering for people, and then when it got to a different extreme, it became disempowering. And I think there's almost like a spectrum where on one side, and you often find that actually people who think this way, they also tend to be religious as well, because if you're religious, you think that if you can control the world, in some situations that you can't control, God can control those situations, and you control those situations by praying. So you also control the situation.
So what I keep on thinking of as you're talking is, I went to therapy in the 80s and did all these different things. And for me, what I've evolved into is that anything that is dogmatic, I don't care what it is. If it's Scientology, if it's even something that you wouldn't look at and say, well, that's like very dogmatic, but it's just that thinking. So it could be religious, it could be anything. So once you get to the point where you're looking at something and you're swallowing it hook, line, and sinker, period, and that is your frame of reference for life, that to me is when you get into dangerous territory. You become a conformist within that thing, whatever it is. And so when you were talking about how those were the expressions later on, Est and Scientology, that's kind of where I see it. It's like it ended up in a parking space that there was nowhere else to go with.
You see it in like Tom Cruise's behavior, because Tom Cruise will, he'll go and scale skyscrapers and hurt by thing, and he's, all powerful and stuff like that. And then it becomes almost like a pyramid cult around Tom Cruise, And and I think it's not just the Scientology or Est, it's also in a lot of the self-help culture that we have today. It's, you could even see in Oprah, Oprah Winfrey, when people go on Oprah, she, gives people books like The Secret or self-help stuff for them to get out of the situations that they're in. Again, it's more victim blaming. It seems like it's empowering, and on some level it is empowering, but it gets to an extent where you can't ask for anything from the society. You can't ask for anything from your social networks. You become an atomized individual. You're the one to blame from that situation. So and I think that reverberates throughout the culture. And I think that's the social sector. But I think politically, it all comes together. And politically, it's less directly connected like it was in the 60s, where Maslow was reading Sartre and Goldwater was reading Buckley, and all these politicians were reading each other, and then people were, getting into it and learning and stuff. But in the 1990s, the Democrats had moved, right, and they moved right because of suburbanites who had grown into individuals. I mean, a lot of the polling they did by people like Stanley Greenberg and all of Clinton's pollsters, they found out that actually these people who, their parents had been Democrats for social needs, their parents were good Labor Democrats, but now they were no longer Democrats because, they were self-actualizing. They were individualists, and now they wanted to be Republicans. So the Democrats reduced their policies for social needs. They increased policies for education, because education meant the equal opportunity that everyone seemed to want at that point. But they reduced their welfare. They had welfare reform. They had a crime bill. They had they wanted to have a grand bargain on Social Security. So they were taking away people's positive social rights because they felt that people wanted to be individuals. They wanted to control their lives, and that they had this human potential. I think Bill Clinton would always say that, he'd look in his family, and Bill Clinton's a really good example of this because this was a guy who came from nothing, basically.
Right. I just want to interject one thing here. So I was just listening to your Bill Clinton episode, which you're covering some of that stuff in here, but really enlightening. And I recommend my listeners to listen to it. Was that the first of a 3-part?
We did the New Democrats episode, then the second one we did on the Clinton presidency, and the third one's going to be with Michael Isikoff, who covered the Monica Lewinsky scandal for Newsweek.
Really listen to it. It's really worth a listen. I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah. So Bill Clinton becomes almost a representative of this because he was a hippie, he was a draft dodger. He listened to all this music. His brother was a musician. He listened to Creedence Clearwater Revival and all these great bands, and was a hippie, was a Rhodes Scholar, then became a politician. And he became a politician for this middle of the road who wanted to better themselves and wanted to be self-actualized and stuff like that. And so he wasn't really like a paternalistic Democrat of the old style that FDR, who just wanted to give people positive rights. He sort of wanted to empower people based on the things that he had learned, these sort of human potential things that he had learned. Because you always say, Bill Clinton would go to a drugstore and he would be like, this guy at the drugstore, he's probably smarter than I am, and he could be in my position if only he was given the opportunity to be in the position. And that's a positive thing to think that,
Mm-hmm.
But is that necessarily the case? Is everyone going to have the opportunity to do all the things that you've done? But they felt that way because they were much more positive about the possibilities of the human being. And in some ways, it's a nice sentiment, but in other ways, it crowds out the ability for social groups to come together and do things for each other in a more sort of communitarian way, like was envisioned by older politicians like FDR or Clem in England. So they changed from political parties based on positive rights to political parties based on this sort of almost like this human potential thing.
Mm-hmm. So how does this movement spill over into other countries? You're in England.
Well, I like to say that America is really where you see it the best, because America in the 60s, it had the music and it had the intellectuals. So it had the Doors and the Beatles, and then it also had Maslow's and Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe and all these guys. England didn't really have the intellectuals, but England had the music.
Mm-hmm.
Beatles, the Rolling Stones. And then France didn't really have the music, and no one really wants to listen to French guys sing because they're not singing in English. But France had the intellectuals. France had Sartre and Camus and Foucault, and so I think it was I like to say it was the opening of the American mind, but it's really a Western movement that happened. It takes root politically in different ways, but in England and America, it's the same thing. You go from Clem and FDR to right-wing politicians like Reagan and Thatcher, and then middle of the road, sort of more human potential politicians like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. And France is a little bit different because people like de Gaulle were, they were from the right, but they did, expand social rights. You have Georges Pompidou, and then you have Mitterrand, who was kind of a socialist, really, and was more left than the politicians that had come in America and in England. I think that realization makes it more of an Anglo movement and an Anglo phenomenon than a French phenomenon. The French have seen parts of it in some of the right-wing politicians, but France still has a huge government, a huge social safety net, especially for citizens. Even people like Le Pen and right-wing politicians in the past have had to, basically say that, social rights are inviolable and we just want to be racist. So yeah, it is a little bit different in France than it is from the Anglosphere. I think it's really at the biggest level, it's really an Anglo phenomenon, but it is a worldwide Western phenomenon, I think.
So when I lived in England in 2012, I noticed that England just seemed so much ahead of where we are social justice-wise and acceptance of same-sex relationships. And even because I did go to France and Belgium. My mother was born in Belgium. She was raised in France. Her family fled the Germans from Belgium, and she ended up being a refugee in France. And so that's her story. There's a documentary coming out about it. I don't know when it's coming out, but I've been
that's awesome.
Years. Yeah, it's called Last Train Leaving Belgium. But I don't know who it was. Probably my boyfriend that we were talking about. This is just a theory. Okay, this is the only sidebar I'll do, I promise. So this is just kind of a theory. What we were talking about is that it seems like my mother was raised Catholic. And when I get back together with her side of the family now, they're all atheists. Like my cousins are like, no, I don't believe in any kind of God or anything like that. And also, I'm kind of feeding all these different ideas into it. When I lived in England and what it was like there, I just felt like, we were so far behind in, our thinking and how we do things and how we treat people. My boyfriend said, I think it's because of World War II and the people who were in World War II, they lost everything, and so this idea of a God, he uses that, my family over there doesn't believe in God. It's almost like they realize the futility of this religion. And I'm not saying anything good or bad about religion regarding that. But so when you were talking about which prime minister was it that passed the same-sex marriage?
David Cameron, yeah. And I would say that it is true almost. I would say that in Europe, there was almost this, I'd say in Europe, Nietzsche was almost like a historian. And some people don't like Nietzsche, but I think he's a really great historian because he basically figures out that religion was no longer the organizing connection between people in Europe, after the 1880s. Yeah. And you do see this, you see it in the 20s in America, but it never really happens. I think in America, yeah. I think probably your boyfriend is right. Because of the war, because of so much death, and the experiences that they had, it really changed them. But America was never really touched by the kinds of bombing campaigns of the Blitz and things like that. But also, I think America provides people with their own isolated communities and different kinds of communal religious experiences that Britain never provided people with. It's much more of a secular culture, and I mean, to some extent to the detriment, because I feel like people here are more, I don't know, they're more pessimistic than Americans tend to be, and they're less self-reliant in a way than the Americans are for some positive and some negative reasons. But yeah, it's definitely true. It's a strange thing, really. But then it's also strange because America gets the two sides of the human potential movement. It gets its irreverent secularism, and it also gets its music. But then it didn't really change. It didn't really change religion in America. Not really, no. In fact, America became more religious in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Do you think we can change the future by understanding this movement?
I definitely think we can change the future by understanding this movement, because I think that the individual message of the human potential movement has really run out. And maybe it might be a boomer thing, but I think that with Brexit, with Trump, you can see that this integrated society with negative rights is becoming a little bit difficult for people. I think Marine Le Pen, as dangerous as she is, she's articulated a kind of communitarian philosophy that's very racist, but is also something that people look back on the negative rights that they received in the 60s and 70s in that country, and they don't necessarily feel like they've benefited as much from it. There's almost like a hollowness they feel in the culture, and you can see it in America in the revival of intellectuals like Christopher Lasch. There's a lot of young academics or academic curious people like myself, the people in my demographic who are actually a little bit, the great social movements of the boomer generation are really respected, but in terms of their utility for creating a better society from right now, people don't really feel that anymore. The conservatives, like I said, like David Cameron, really brought in, the Equality Marriage Act. Conservatives seem to no longer really be focused on moral issues. They're really focused on individual rights, and McConnell in the Senate is focused on the economy and trying to make sure that poor people don't have anything. And I really think that because of that, people are starting to see that both on the right and the left, it's quite secular, and it's quite secular because of this human potential movement. People wanted to be free, they got to be free. Some people like being free and they want power, both on the right and the left. But I think that on the right, you're seeing with senators like Tom Cotton, like Josh Hawley, you're seeing conservatives who actually want increased economic rights now. You're seeing, movements like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You're really seeing this human potential focus on individual rights really relapse, and people are much more focused on community and trying to have communities in a digital age. They're much more focused on isolation, on loneliness. They're much more focused on, economic rights like the minimum wage, like labor rights, collective rights. And I think, so the human potential movements really run out. But the reason we had the society that we had, the reason we had almost this center right Reagan Clinton condition that we had was a product of the human potential movement. And the reason that it's no longer satisfying is because the human potential movement is really run out. So there's a space, I think, and it's a tricky space to really work in, but there's a space for a kind of emboldened positive rights movement. Conservative parties are moving to the left on economics a little bit. You see it with the Boris Johnson administration. They're trying to increase corporation tax. They're furloughing people and giving people money. You're seeing it with the Senate right now and the House right now, with Mitt Romney trying to pass a minimum wage bill, with Marco Rubio trying to pass new tax credits. You're sort of seeing a drift away from the individual to the collective. It's dangerous because it's come out as racial and and quite identitarian in many ways, which is why I brought up Marine Le Pen. But I do think that people have gotten tired of the freedoms that the human potential movement brought to them. And there's a real space right now, I think, for talented politicians, for talented organizers, for talented policymakers, for talented philosophers, artists, to try to communicate a new kind of message that's going to bring everyone together and is going to create a future that has many of the great qualities that the human potential movement gave us, this great sort of flowering of individual creativity and personal effort, but also is more communitarian. And I think by understanding the history, by understanding why people wanted what they want, by understanding why they left the world of, authoritarian, socialist and fascist regimes and the white picket fence world of the 50s that was crushing and meant that people couldn't live and love and do what they wanted, why that was powerful, why it ended up in great swayed victories for libertarian conservatives and created a new Democrat movement that was more to the right in economics, but more to the left on social issues. And why people don't necessarily want that as much right now. I think by understanding that, you'll be able to create a new political movement, a new political center. And I think in my own life, I recently was an organizer on the London mayoral campaign. I ran part of the Southeast division of the campaign for an independent candidate. And he was a conservative, and my politics are much more, liberal and left. But he was trying to articulate a message of, of communitarianism, of, on the campaign trail, he would talk about atomization. He would talk about loneliness. He would talk about, collective rights. He would talk about communities. And he was really articulating a message that I understood from what the Conservatives and the Labour Party were offering in the past. And I really think is to our future, which will be much more positive, trying to create positive rights for people, trying to find out what worked in the 60s and 70s, what people will write about in the day. I mean, I could talk to you about the 1920s and 1930s and talk about, why there was left economic movements, what people write about in the 1920s and 1930s, what people write about in the 1950s and 1960s, and how to bring those two poles together and create something that's better, that's newer, and that's really in line with what people want today. So it's almost like a marketing thing. Like you study the past to understand how you sell, new ideas to people.
So that's what you do? You're a lobbyist?
Yeah, I'm a lobbyist, but it's more for business. And campaign work is more intermittent. But yeah, I have worked on political campaigns before, and intend to. I'm going to be honest, intend to in the future. And I think this kind of message. It's left economically, it's left socially, but is trying to create a more community-based politics is really what I'm interested in doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that of the human potential movement. And I also think, like, my own life, when I was a teen, like, I read Kerouac. I thought it was great. I thought everything he said was great, and I wanted to be Kerouac. But I think as I got older, I started to realize that this wasn't everything that a human being could be, and it was just the human being as himself. But what could a human being be, in a community? And I think it's really important, and I think it's what we're missing. I think it's the reason for things like Brexit and Trump. I know other people will say different things, but yeah, and I think it's a bridge to the future.
Mm-hmm. That's an optimistic view of the potential future. I like that. It seems like in my life, I've been extreme in different ways, even in the 80s, like that. You were talking about the, if it's in your life, it's because you brought it there. I went through that whole thing. But it seems like
just before, young people, and I think I went in the 1984 episode, young people between the ages of 18 and 30 voted for Reagan. They voted for Reagan because they want to be rich. They want to be yuppies. It's what happens. People who were younger than the boomers, they voted for Reagan because he was optimistic. He was individual. It was freedom. It was what freedom felt like then.
Okay. I didn't vote for Reagan. I didn't vote. I don't even know if I was old enough. Let me think. What year was that? I was not even involved in politics yet. But I lived in a very conservative house. My dad was very conservative. He voted for Nixon. But I think what I was trying to say before is everything is about balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that about you on the show. Sometimes I think you're conservative because of the way you measure things out and you weigh things against each other. And I like that you do that. I'm not that person. I'm more like Vaughn. I get very emotional about things and sometimes get stuck in that where I can't see the forest for the trees. But I've learned over time to listen to other people talk and do what you do because you guys have a lot of really good points. And I like that you look at both sides of an argument, and I don't, you guys, you're always like, well, who is your favorite politician? And you're kind of like against that whole idea, that concept. You are, I think you said that. I don't know if it was you or Simon, but it's interesting because I would say like Obama and Jimmy Carter, but then I listened to one of your episodes and I was like, yeah, that's like having like a rock star kind of thing. I don't know. You guys are swaying me. You guys sway me back and forth. You make me think. And I really appreciate that because, if I just stay with the choir or the congregation, that's all I'm going to hear. And my brain is not going to be, it's not going to move forward with different ideas. And I do really appreciate that about your show and about how you present things. So
thank you tremendously. And I would say that, I'm not conservative in any way, but I would say that I often look at people as systems in a broader narrative. And I think that the ideas that people have, although they're their own ideas and they've thought through them, I think they're reflective of where they are, who they are, where they find themselves in. And I think that it's allowed me to develop a sort of empathy. It doesn't come out as emotional. It comes out as, analytical and stuff. But I think I have a deep empathy for people, whoever they are, however they feel about the world, because I sort of see them as part of a broader system. And I think, like even with characters that I thought that I would, hate, like Ayn Rand and, M.F. Buckley because he was funny and interesting, but even characters I thought I would despise, I see why they felt the way they did, why their formative experiences gave them that view of the world, and maybe it means that I'm a bit of a relativist, and that's probably true. And someone like Vaughan probably thinks of it more morally, and she probably thinks that people have the same way of should think the same way, or the moral when you get through the questions by thinking about them. But I don't know. I mean, maybe she's right, but it's the way I kind of have always thought about people.
Well, I know for the past 4 years, I have basically felt like you were either an enemy of the state, and I never felt that way about. I'm obviously liberal. I used to be independent, but this last election forced my hand and made me become a registered Democrat. But for self-preservation, I really just had to cut myself off from any kind of debate about politics with the people that were in my life that were supporting Trump. It was ugly. And so this way that you're talking, this way that you're thinking, it's my only hope to bridge that again, and to try and not, just honestly hate people. And that took an emotional and physical toll on everybody, I think. And so kind of plodding along, listening to the way you reason things out. And, I don't like that we are so polarized. I don't like that. And honestly, in the past, I have voted Republican. So, but, there was like, and then when my guy lost, it was like, even when Gore lost, who I voted for, who should have won, who really did win, it was like, I wasn't so mad. He definitely won. He would have been an interesting president. And I really liked what you were saying about, and I didn't know this, about how he was telling Clinton that he should not sign this "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." I think it was. Was it the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell"? And I thought that was really interesting.
I think Gore was more like the New Democrats, when they saw his speech at the convention, they weren't very happy about it. He had that big climate change thing. He was more left. I mean, he had Joe Lieberman probably because back then the party was more to the right. But yeah, he was more of a genuine liberal than I think Clinton was. Clinton's much.
Yeah.
I think if you listen to his speeches, he's very, I would say, idiosyncratic. He really is this big human potential politician. Yeah. He's very, very different, I think, from the standards.
So, yeah, is there anything else you want to tell us about this movement that you haven't touched on?
No. I think I've kind of covered the basics of it.
I want you to kind of think about the movement and the time period that you talked about. Where do we see this in pop culture?
I would say maybe in movies like Wall Street. I would say that in pop culture, you have to really go to the interviews that Erhard gave, or interviews around Scientology. It's much broader than specific pop culture moments, because I think it's what people have come to believe together. And I don't think there are big pop culture moments, apart from sort of interviews with Erhard. But yeah, I don't think there are big pop culture moments that you could say really capture it. In the 1970s, you had filmmakers like Polanski and Scorsese making these movies about sort of individuals that are much more dark, and much more self-reflective. But that was a reflection of the left's take on society. You had movies about the Vietnam War that were much more rah-rah, about, the Deer Hunter. And in the 1980s, you had movies like Wall Street, which were actually about excess and yuppiedom, and that didn't really deal in moral grays. That saw success as, basically the goal of life, financial success is the goal of life, things like that. But I would say that I think it's much more in the reason why those things were made, right? So I'd say like a movie like The Graduate is a guy who's it's difficult for audiences to really watch The Graduate at the time because it was a guy who had left university and he didn't know what to do, right? He goes home and he has a relationship with this girl who's age relevant, and then her mother starts to develop a relationship with him, and it's this very self-reflective movie. It's a movie about transition and change and not really knowing what you want to do. But at the time, people who would be graduates, they didn't really have that kind of experience. They were just expected to just become men in the grey flannel suit and just go off to work. And why these movies were made was because these directors wanted to be more self-referential and self-reflective, and to try to take the structures of movies that were, the A, B, C, 3 act movies, and make them more reflective, more, about understanding yourself, more about thinking, more about doing things that don't necessarily lead to an ultimate end. And I think it's the reason why they did the things that they did. It might not. Graduate is quite explicit, but it's not always very explicit. I think it's the reason why these things were made is the product of the human potential movement, as opposed to this big giant scene in a movie or seeing on television is a product of the human potential movement.
Interesting. So do you think that it was a failed experiment, a successful experiment, or somewhere in the middle?
The writer of Surveillance Capitalism, who's a lady who's a business writer, has recently wrote about how the human potential movement is almost like a movement in the history of the mind that moves us from conformity to trying to be ourselves. But now with the internet, the algorithms on the internet, whether you're shopping or you're collecting data for COVID, or you're watching videos on TikTok, it's collecting all this data, and the algorithms are saying, wait, this person wants to be an individual, but this person is like this person is like this person. Let's sell them this to them, these kinds of adverts to them, these kinds of people to them that look just like them. And so that the algorithms notice in the connections that people are very similar, but we think we're individuals. Her name is Shoshana Zuboff, and she thinks that there's going to be another kind of opening in the human mind that the human potential movement really created, to a future that is more about positive rights, who have not got the benefits of the human potential movement, to become more individual, and then to this new human potential movement. But the way the internet works, the way the data companies work, they are trying to stop this happening, and they're trying to make us all into just sort of like atomized individuals. Think they're individuals, but caging us off from other people, caging us into vacuums where we don't talk to anyone who doesn't believe what we believe, where we don't know anyone who doesn't believe what we believe.
Do you think that they're doing that on purpose, or it's just a byproduct of what they're doing?
It's a byproduct of capitalism. No one is doing this on purpose. If you got Mark Zuckerberg here to do an interview with you, he wouldn't say that he was doing that. The head of Amazon wouldn't say that they were doing that. I think the intention is just to sell things to people. But I think, whether it's or whether it's some other policy, like we have to kind of get control over these things. But I think that the human potential movement led us to this juncture where, we think we're individuals, but the systems don't necessarily think that we're individuals. And where do we go? Where do we go from here? But it was sort of dealing with a time where that first, as Shoshana Zuboff calls it, the sort of first individual period is kind of waning in terms of its benefits for us. And what do we do? And what we do from here is a complicated question. But before we go into the future, we need to ask how we got here and why some of the things were positive that led us here, but why some of those things were negative, and how do we fix those things, and how do we take different things from different periods. I mean, it's what they did in the French Revolution. You know, the French Revolution, they were obsessed with the Roman Republic. You know, they also thought about things that happened recently in America, and they were trying to create a society, you know, that took things from the past, that understood why they got where they were, and trying to create solutions. And I think this is the thing about history. You know, history is really valuable for people who work in politics. I mean, the historical method is valuable for everyone, but it's really, really valuable for people in politics. And trying to create a future is a difficult thing, but it's a thing that we can't ignore. Like, it's a problem that we have to deal with, and we can only deal with it by knowing how we got to where we were, and also not being so cynical about the motives of the people that brought us here. You know, knowing that they were people who wanted things. They wanted things to be better for themselves in some way, even if they ignored other people. But knowing that it might not have been great for society. You know, the main point I really want people to know about this history is when they study the history of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, is to look less at the confrontation that is obvious between the left and the right, between the Goldwaterites and the SDS, the student movement, the gay rights movement of Harvey Milk, or the Black Panthers of Fred Hampton and Huey P. Newton, or the feminist movement. You know, to not look so much at the confrontations, but to look at where they were agreeing, and to find that created a consensus. You know, I think a lot of people look at leaders and think that the leaders were the ones that sort of made the world into the way it was. You know, if there wasn't Reagan, then America would be this, and this. If there wasn't Thatcher, it'd be this. You know, England would be this, and this. I think really, really need to look at artists, look at thought leaders on some level, and then look at what people are saying to themselves. You know, how they're rationalizing life. Look at the social history. Look at, you know, what people wanted, what people were doing, how they spent their money, where they were going, who they loved, who they didn't love, you know, what music they listened to, you know, what clubs did they go to, and to find out, you know, what people share and what people think, and how people feel about society. And because I think that's the only real way to do history. You know, and I think history is endlessly valuable on the level of the stories that you can learn. I think it's my favorite subject by a mile, really, and it's really valuable for creating a future for ourselves. Because how do we know where to go if we don't know where we came from?
Agreed. I really enjoyed talking to you today, Tobi. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure. I love to talk about this topic. I'm really happy that you invited me here. I mean, I really like that you appreciate the impressions of America.
There you have it. Tobi Olowe and the complex, all-encompassing history of the human potential movement. To find out more about Tobi, the Human Potential Movement, and the Impressions of America podcast, be sure to check out our episode notes. Also, just a reminder and a request, if you like the content of Armchair Historians, there are several ways that you can support us. And believe me, in the mysterious world of the internet, any one or a combination of these things will help to improve our algorithms and increase listenership. First, you can like, subscribe, and wherever possible, leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Next, you can follow and interact with us through your social media accounts. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Finally, if you really enjoy the show and are in a place to do so, you can also become a patron through Patreon or buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi. Every little bit helps. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.